Good morning, viewers. I want to tell you a little bit about Symbiosis Law School, Pune. Now, the Symbiosis Law School in Pune, you may or may not have heard of it, but I'm sure if you are a legal enthusiast, you would have, because it stands for excellence in the legal education. It has been ranked 7th in the year 2019 amongst participating law schools by the Ministry of Human Resource Development, Government of India, under the National Institution Ranking Framework, or what they call the NIRF, which is now the trending ranking methodology for students and institutions across India. It was conferred with the prestigious Gold Star Award by the Bar Council of India in February 2013. Now, why am I telling you all this? There is a reason. Today my guest on the show is Dr. Shashikala Gurpur. Now, she is the director of the Symbiosis Law School, Pune, and the Dean Faculty of Law, Symbiosis International Deemed University. She is a former member of the Law Commission of India and a former member of the Academic Council, National Judicial Academy. Now, the context of this discussion with Dr. Shashikala Gurpur is very topical. We have just come out of, not come out yet, but we are still trying to combat the COVID-19 crisis. We have had 4 versions of the lockdown, during which many people suffered. The people who suffered the most were the migrants, people who had moved from their state to other states because they could not go back. They had no jobs and they had no food, which of course a lot of NGOs and the government of course tried to support. Now they're trickling back into their states and they find that the labor law has been abandoned by some of the states. Now, what we can see today is probably a constitutional, I would call it a crisis, because although there are acts which can deal with epidemics, they are being used for purposes beyond that. Welcome to the show, Dr. Shashikala.
Thank you.
And let me just ask you, is this a constitutional transformation or is this a constitutional crisis? That's the first question I have for you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Brian, for the opportunity. In my opinion, this is a situation which is begging for constitutional transformation because we already have a constitution which gives us enough scope for interpreting right to health as part of the fundamental right to live. The fundamental right to life articulated under Article 21 has been expanded to include right to health by various judgments and interpretations. So by virtue of that, already we have enough stuff in the constitution, enough strength in the constitution. It is to transform that constitution as a living constitution by making it speak for the vulnerable, to speak for those who are affected by this pandemic very badly. When we speak of law, in the context of any pandemic of this kind, because in our lifetime we have witnessed this, a couple of centuries since we have witnessed pandemic across the world. At that time, pandemic was regional and then it spread to other countries. But if you look at the Spanish flu or if you look at the bubonic plague. But today, because of the globalization, the pandemic has assumed global proportion within no time. So in this context, how the law should function? If you look at the way in which law has been looked at in the context of health per se and pandemic in particular, law has been considered as one of the important social determinants. And law as a social determinant needs to render its power to harness the structures to work towards everybody and towards the vulnerable in particular. Law has to be mediating the social determinants such as economics or power or politics or activism, aside from the structured healthcare infrastructure. So if you look at right to health per se, it's talking about access to healthcare, it's talking about affordable healthcare, it's talking about quality healthcare, it's talking about equity in the entitlement to the healthcare. However, what we saw in this pandemic was that Government of India handled it very well, no doubt, but our preparedness in terms of our constitutional guarantees and the specific attention to be paid to the vulnerable. Now, who is something that could have still been better. One is that we declared, when we speak about domestic violence or labor law later on, we will come into that point. When we declared in the beginning, we just declared as if India is a homogeneous country which has affordability in everybody's hand if overnight a lockdown is declared. Of course, the preparation for the lockdown was there for 3 or 4 days in degrees, but the real preparation which ought to have been there in terms of securing livelihood, which is part of right to life, in terms of paying special attention to those who are vulnerable, was not done enough. We have a situation in India which is not very homogeneous even in economic power terms. If you look at the production in India, 40% is concentrated in mega cities, particularly in Mumbai, and then a lot of it in Bangalore, in Delhi, in Madras, Calcutta. So did we pay specific attention? Was our urban governance, was our governance structure sensitive to this reality? Whether we have faltered somewhere in delivering the promise of right to livelihood or right to life, which includes right to health, when the two rights are, or two subcategories within the rights are in conflict, whether our executive, whether our governance structure could have done better is the critical question that we ask when we look at the transformative power of the Constitution. Let me give you an example. Whenever, for example, a disaster happens, disasters usually are natural disasters, but there could be man-made or human-made disaster as well. Like, for example, there could be a riot, there could be a war, there could be a war-like situation. Today, we have COVID-19, which is a disaster. It has been declared as a disaster, and state approach has been to treating it as a disaster. Does it mean that in disaster situation we suspend all the rights? Does it mean that a disaster which is like a national emergency, nobody has any kind of right and it becomes a total police raj where the state has the control? Or does it mean that right to life is still a sacrosanct right? Because if you look at post-emergency judgments, it has been told that under no circumstances, including national emergency, right to life will be suspended. So if you read the larger interpretation of the right to life, we have to put every other aspect secondary to right to life. So this is where you would have seen a host of judgments. Some of them I am going to quickly brief here for the benefit of the audience, since you have raised this question, whether we should look at a kind of dialogue with the state in terms of those who are vulnerable. Who is vulnerable? The very word vulnerable comes from the word vulnus, which means the wound. So vulnerable is the one who is susceptible to harm, one who is susceptible to harm because they do not have the resources both qualitatively and quantitatively. Quantitatively, they do not have resources because they are day-to-day wage earners and they are dependent on a system which employs them. They are quantitatively having limited resources because if the system doesn't provide employment, they are in rented houses, they are outsiders. I mean, they are not the locals who have the support system. So if they have to lean on a shoulder to cry, they have to rely on their relatives, either who are staying in the nearby area. So suddenly when there is a lockdown, there is no preparedness of the stress that could be caused, loneliness that could be caused, helplessness that could be caused. These are the people who need in a month, at least for a family of four, 2,000 to 3,000 rupees worth groceries to sustain themselves. Even that preparation they never do because they are daily wage earners. So did we not consider these things when we declared? Did we make this money available in their bank account at least? Or did we cast a duty on their employers who have benefited from their labor, or the state which has benefited from their labor for so long? So these are the fundamental questions which are asking for a transformative dialogue with the state in terms of constitutional guarantees, especially to the vulnerable. So vulnerable are quantitatively less resourceful, qualitatively because they do not have the wherewithal to think big. Our community legal service center is working with the police now in documenting the migrants as they are leaving the state. So we came to know there are some 10 factors, and one of them is rumor. Second is no way of verifying the rumor. Landlords are not letting them stay because after 1 month's arrears of rent, they do not want them to continue. They don't have any kind of other support structure in the state, although they have been here for decades. Now, this is the kind of thing that CDC or Center for Disease Control in the US took into account, that the vulnerable become further vulnerable in crisis situation like hurricane or this kind of pandemic. Even in the US, the situation of migrants is very bad, immigrants as they call them, or regional migrants. So this happens because we have not had the wherewithal in terms of security laws or security, social security laws or social security guarantees in the normal time. In the normal time, when you do not do it, a 2-month lockdown is not, it is going to crack your fabric because your fabric is not strong. So that is where I think that constitutional transformation in this context is very important. The other point is, when it is the police Raj, the police were taking over the role of not only security but also of ensuring the lockdown to contain the spread of the disease. So the approach that they took in the beginning was the force or coercion approach, but later on there was a lot of dialogue. But did we train our police force to look at that empathetic kind of approach and the dialogue kind of approach? In some places it did, where the leadership of the police was good. So we have a series of cases, like for example, in the Samil Ahmed case in Telangana, in the month of March, the High Court of Telangana said that equipments have to be, personal protective equipments have to be supplied. You cannot suddenly bring Emergency Services Maintenance Act without ensuring that PPE is guaranteed. So the high courts have reminded that many a times volunteers who are working with the police have to look after the migrants, exodus to be stopped before proper safety of travel is guaranteed. Unfortunately, what happened was, in the first stage of lockdown, one of the Supreme Court judges went in Delhi to the migrant camp and supplied food. When the second and the third phase of lockdown came, when the migrants were hit by train because they were sleeping in the train track in Aurangabad, the very same Supreme Court was talking like Mary Antoinette, that who will stop them from going? It is the executive which has to work, not us. Court's apathy, when the executive exercised its power and its governance and planning discretion, has been there during emergency. We have very bad memories of the 70s. But it is the very same court in the form of Justice Khanna which dissented. Today, the courts, the way the Supreme Court reflected in the public interest litigation about the migrants, it feels like whether court has abnegated its responsibility, as Advocate Sanjay Hegde has written in the Hindu. On the 29th of March, you have a very interesting decision there in case of Aditya Chadda from Punjab, where they said that social distancing and supply of essentials in Punjab requires judicial intervention. So court made order on that. In case of Jimraj Milton in Madras, there were 2-3 cases where they said that tests have to be available, quarantine for the people coming from abroad should be strictly maintained. So these cases came in the early part. On the 9th of April, this case came. And after that, there was one more case from Mr. Milton. So they were talking about patient increase in the hospital. So not to confine it to government hospital. So every time, the cases which came before the court showed how the pandemic management has not been very structured and there were flaws, and the reflection of the court resulted in, for example, allowing the private hospitals to take patients. In Pune, you know, our own Symbiosis hospital has been doing a wonderful service. The rate of death is very, very less, and extremely good interventions have been made. Extremely good facilities have been given. Separate children's ward, adults ward, etc. are there. It's running to the full capacity. And the professional job which is being done in last 1 month has resulted in containing the virus and treating the people successfully. So if private hospitals weren't opened with the MOU with the corporation, this kind of escalation in the peak period couldn't have been dealt with. In Delhi, we had the Basudev case, very interesting case, where a handicapped alleged charas peddler was a prisoner, and he was also diabetic. So he couldn't be handling the crowded prisons in the face of COVID threat. So the Delhi High Court on the 17th of April gave a decision to resolve the release of this person as an exceptional case. However, they also gave guidelines that all states will have to see that, because all our prisons are running to 3 times the capacity. overcrowded. So they said that there has to be a vigilance committee created, and that committee has to classify prisoners. Those who have served 7 years of under trial imprisonment could be released, provided they are not there for any offense relating to rape or corruption or some other serious terrorism and other kinds of linked offenses. So this kind of relieving the prisons resulted in up to 70, 60 prisoners being released in some places little more than that. On the 3rd of April, Registrar of Bombay High Court entertained a case which again talked about some kind of what we call as support to the migrant laborers, screening of the laborers, free screening to be made available. On the 3rd of April, we also had interesting cases, very interesting case in Mumbai. In this case, in Sopan Langekar case, what happened was somebody was imprisoned because they obstructed the police process of lockdown. So police had put them in the lockup. Then the lawyers went to the court and asking for release of the person. So the court said that since courts are running with very small amount of staff in the lockdown period, they should be prioritizing cases. Somebody being inside for blocking or impeding the lockdown cannot be an urgent case. Let us look at only urgent cases. So this person's case can be brought once the lockdown is completed. So courts were ruthless in classifying these cases. So somebody who went against the lockdown was not going to get any kind of sympathy. So finally, because of this, because there again the conflict between constitutional guarantee or the liberty, that's what was argued, that his liberty is at stake for a small folly of not cooperating with the lockdown. But the court said that we have to be very specific what is an urgent case and what is a non-urgent case, and this lockdown is done in order to contain the virus spread. Therefore there should be cooperation expected from the community. So let his release question be brought after the lockdown is completed. Therefore, now what the police is doing is, if they find such people, then they make them go and work in the quarantine wards and help the patients, keep them there to serve with proper protection. So this is how the rush in the prison or lockup area also has been relieved. The one last case I would like to discuss with you is the 9th April case, the Allahabad High Court case, where they said that some of the lawyers who are suffering because of lack of court process and lack of income earned by the court process need to be supported by the Bar Council of India. So overall, I would like to say that whether it is the implementation of the Disaster Management Act, which resulted in these shelters and which resulted in these quarantines and resulted in the lockdown implementation, whether it is the question of implementing the Pandemic Act, which gave only 4 sections are there in the act, but it gives power to the government to contain the spread, which is a colonial legislation which needed to be more humanized, because this is no more the state which is alien, it is our own state. What we saw was a kind of situation which is like emergency, but which was handled well because of some of the human elements who were well trained to handle the situation, which could have been handled better. I am going to give you some examples when we are dealing with the domestic violence, which could have been handled better if we had a kind of understanding that state is a trustee as well. Not only state is a police, but state is also a trustee, and it has a responsibility. And the responsibility is not through the enforcement or coercive element alone. There is also the distributive justice element, which should have been anticipated and handled in a better way. This is my submission when we talk about transformative approach to the Constitution, where we constantly reinvent the Constitution to give voice and to give strength to those who are otherwise either invisible or feeble in the framework of the Constitution due to their vulnerability.
Taking off from what you have told me, I've listened very intently to you. I wanted to ask you one question. I may be way off the mark, but is the right to life absolute, or like freedom of the press, of freedom of expression? Is it not absolute, like the Supreme Court said the other day in the case of Mr. Arnab Goswami?
Yeah, see, freedoms are more qualitative, that freedoms can be suspended with restrictions which are reasonable, and the reasonableness of the restriction has to be judged from case to case. But right to life is an absolute right. Under no circumstances you can suspend or interfere with right to life, which also includes liberty in the sense of not to be interfered unless there is due consideration and due process of law. So in case of freedoms, reasonable restriction is there. That is why in case of that lockdown blocker case, Bombay High Court clearly told that his liberty is there, but that liberty has been put under reasonable restriction. Therefore, his case we cannot prioritize.
Yeah, but when I say right to life is being circumscribed, because I want to protect your life, and therefore I have to restrict the other person's life and liberty also to protect your life. That is the question I wanted to ask you actually.
Life vis-a-vis death. It is about survival. It is about right to life being extrapolated in terms of right to health, etc. Between the two conflicting private entities, if there is a question of choosing the right to life, it is complementarity rather than conflicting. One cannot be killed because other has to be saved. So this is the approach that in the British and Spanish and other crowded context, where they had to spare the elderly in order to use the limited facilities for the young. That would not be justified in Indian context because of the constitution's sacrosanct nature of right to life. Yeah.
And the other question from whatever we have spoken already is the Pandemic Act and the Disaster Management Act. We are in a quasi-federal system. I mean, India is not completely unitary. So how does that work out? Does the central government have the right to take away from the states, and the states have no rights at all? How does it work actually?
No, if you have seen the current way of working,
that's the current way. That's the current way. But prior to that, I was talking about
prior to that, it's a colonial legislation. A Disaster Management Act is more decentralized because states have been delegated the power. But in the Pandemic Act, no doubt, central government has the power. But we assume that government there has to be interpreted because of the proximity to the citizens and the size of the country as both central and state government.
Okay.
However, the distribution of funds is to be very reasonably interpreted in that case. It is the fund issue that comes into question because with the GST, everything is centralized.
Okay, we'll move on to the next topic that we wanted to talk about was domestic violence. When families are locked down together and either because of alcohol or lack of it, sometimes domestic violence has increased. What is your take on it? I'm sure there are cases, plenty of them. They may not have come to light right now, and people are frustrated that they don't have a job, they don't have any sustenance. They take it out on their families, mainly the spouses, whether it's the husband or the wife, but mostly the husband on the wife. So what's your take on it, doctor?
See, I have done a little bit of study from the context of Europe, Australia, then United Nations initiatives and our country, and then Pune. So when I looked at from the local to the global, the evidences and the studies clearly show that domestic violence is a shadow pandemic. So when this real pandemic is there, in the shadow of this pandemic, there's another pandemic which is raging in the houses, as one of the spokespersons of United Nations said. If you look at the background, whenever pandemic struck in Africa, whether it is HIV or Ebola, it was very clear that there was multiple vulnerabilities of the women, like for example, not having access to money or being physically overpowered by the men or being over responsible, kind of existing cultural fabric. And the poverty exacerbated their vulnerability. So it resulted in increased incidence of them being deprived of the treatment or them being worst hit in the case of pandemic. We have a situation of lockdown resulting in increased incidence of domestic violence to women in Kosovo, and there was increased risk, and the mechanism for protection of these women was not thought of in many countries. But the systems then declared that they have zero tolerance for such domestic violence. Like if I share with you, in the US also, after 2-3 days of lockdown, some of the courts announced that any emergency hearing can be done online and the court clerk can be approached. They had especially the protection and the safety of women and children in view, because violence continues to resurface despite progress and despite development. So in Papua New Guinea, they had reports saying that earlier it was every 1 in 3 case. Now it was 2 in 3 case. So there was doubling of the violence. Most of the United Nations argument, including in case of Nigeria, put a spotlight on this domestic violence during the pandemic and lockdown time, and they said that ending the abuse with awareness is the key phrase. So in India, we did a little study about what the National Commission for Women was receiving in terms of its online, because, you know, posts were prohibited. There was only one means of calling up the helpline, or there was also what we call as possibility of email. And if you look at the net penetration in our country, it is still less than 8%. And if you look at the skill of emailing, even though women hold mobile phones, the majority of them are either illiterate or information illiterate or internet illiterate. So National Commission for Women showed that there was a kind of reporting of violence, which was 302 in February, which was 270 in January. And in the month of March, just between 15th and 30th, the incidences were suddenly jumping, weekly incidences were suddenly jumping from 23 to 67. And in April, it recorded 291 incidents. So if we are believing that this must be an exaggeration or assumption, we have the evidence which shows that there is increased incidence. Interestingly, NCW chairperson Sharma, she said that in northern India, the report was very high in the state of Punjab, and Rajasthan, one teacher called up. His daughter, whose husband was also a teacher, was not being provided access to food. So violence forms are also very interesting, you know. It may not be physical violence alone. I'm not ruling out physical violence at all. It may not be physical violence alone. It could be this kind of indirect kind of violence. And what happens is, when all these people are under captivity, they virtually go crazy, because lockdown is nothing but captivity inside the house. So generally police also have had an apathy, because they are very busy with dealing with the pandemic. So there has been an assumption that there is a threefold increase, not just double, threefold increase of domestic violence during lockdown. So in a way, lockdown period has resulted in a challenge to the right to life with dignity in these cases. So Jagori, this NGO from Delhi, reported that it had 50% decrease in calls. Now, what does that indicate? That doesn't mean violence has decreased. It means that they are not able to pick the phone and call, because this predator is looking over them, you know. It has been very much reported that women are very scared to report. Hitherto, you know, they will get out of the house, talk to a friend or talk to someone. Now they have to live in the proximity of the predator or a perpetrator. Now, one of the first remedies in domestic violence is to break the pattern, to divide, to segregate the two. Now that segregation only is not happening. And their need, suppose he has pounded her head or hit her or done something, then there is no health services. And if she has problems and she has to undergo abortion, hospitals are not going to entertain this case. So help in distress and healthcare and supervision, etc., were missing. So slowly, local administration woke up to this reality, because even in Pune, we had daily in every station, we have got 40 plus 40 stations, rural and urban. Daily in every station, on an average, 2 cases were being reported. So 40 into 2 is 80. So you can imagine 80 plus 80, 100 cases per day. So there is a lot of increase in these cases. So they thought that since during lockdown segregation is difficult, they sent their ASHA workers. ASHA workers became the vigilante. Along with the ASHA workers, there were the police, and there were also the counselors, professional counselors and NGOs collaborating. So there was a committee created in every region and every station level, because of which the psychological support, restriction on the control by the perpetrator, and restricted access could be tackled. In worst cases, what the police did was make these men to come to the government department where there was shortage of staff and made them do the attendance job or clean the office kind of job. So daily 2 or 3 such majesties used to report to these offices and do their calling, because of their misbehavior. Because you cannot, in some cases, they have also kept them in the quarantine areas to cut the abuse. Now, liquor was in Telangana state, Chief Minister declared that liquor should not be made available because he said that this is going to increase the violence. But there are conflicting arguments about that. Some women feel that give him the liquor, let him sleep off, he won't trouble. But that doesn't happen usually. The moment they have the liquor, then all their stress comes forward and the woman becomes the target. Then in some cases, hotlines have been introduced, legal aids have been given. So these are all following the United Nations model, whereby they have looked at that. Now, Domestic Violence Act has been taken, and also the Nirbhaya Act, which is the Criminal Law Amendment Act, have been taken to protect both women and girls from being the target of violence, and even children from being the target of violence in the lockdown period. So in the villages as well as in the city, these cases have been tackled based on this United Nations formula with the help of 21,000 ASHA workers as far as Maharashtra is concerned. In some cases, these men have been home quarantined as well, that they have not been allowed to get out of the house to procure the liquor, or they have not been allowed to get out of a particular room. So ASHA workers have intervened and seen. So these are the kind of remedies which have been temporarily introduced in order to break the pattern of violence. So this is where I feel that none of us should undermine domestic violence. It's going on, and it is brushed under the carpet because of many other myths, which I always say. The myth is that woman feels if she comes out, then she's not sure how she's going to be living on her own, somehow social stigma and insecurity for the children. Better to live with the bad husband than bring children outside of that and expose them to other vulnerabilities or challenges. So this is how domestic violence has been on. But then the best way is to take support from psychology and from law to see, and also the police to see in a very validating manner, to see that the perpetrator is also subject to therapy, and there is a kind of proper equation created whereby that imbalance in the power which creates this dominance is neutralized. So this is how long term it can be abated.
I think one of the major issues here is proximity. Proximity is something that we had not planned for. No family has planned for proximity 24/7, and so this proximity perhaps has caused one of the issues. The second problem is priorities. I think the police are fully engaged with the COVID-19 lockdown, and all other agencies, including the NGOs, are fully engaged with helping people survive rather than looking at all these priorities. So these two combined, I think, have made the problem worse. But now let's move on to the third part of our discussion, where the northern states, the interstate migrants have been working in many states for many years. Some of them have come recently, some have been short term, some have been, they're working in hotel industry, they're working in most of the service sectors, in textile industries, wherever they have been traveling. And now they have gone back to their respective states, but in the respective states, the economy is pretty bad. So people have said that, and the governments have found that it's easy to suspend the laws or tweak the laws using this particular COVID-19 pandemic as the excuse, get the businesses back to work, and through the businesses, the people back to work. I don't know whether that's a regression or whether that's a reform. It cannot be a reform, obviously. So, what's your take on that?
See, India has already been accused of being low on the index of ease of doing business. One of the indicators of ease of doing business is the flexible labor. By flexible, they mean hire and fire being very easy. And some of the unproductive, labor taking responsibility for their productivity, and some of the unproductive labor are having the potential to be fired and being replaced. So they are always on their gear. But what happens is that ease of doing business is multiple factors. If you want to attract investment from China, when people are quitting China because of China's non-transparent and dangerous behavior and untrustworthiness, then to attract such businesses, whether tweaking the labor law alone is going to be the panacea, or are there other things such as infrastructure, such as other dimensions to come in? The argument is that to woo the migrants from leaving, they have done this amendment. But the reality is that it is cost cutting. The reality is that it is a kind of shot in the foot, because in order to save some money, they have done a long-term loss to the organization, because people who are skilled, if you lose them, then bringing new people and skilling them again is going to cost you. So how do you view the cost is the issue. Then the moment you suspend labor law, what happens? It may look like the justification on the part of these states, whether it is Uttar Pradesh. Now, Uttar Pradesh has reneged on that because of the union pressure, trade union pressure. But Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, the justification they give is that we want to end the inspection Raj. Where labor inspectors will come and inspect us from time to time, and some of the employees cannot be fired even if they're underperforming. Now that they should be looking at in the bureaucracy as well, and everywhere as well, not just in the manufacturing process. And government cannot be just watching over, given its constitutional commitment. So, because once again, work is connected to livelihood, which is right to life. So in these cases, what happens if you suspend labor law? First thing that is going to be a casualty, and I am arguing that this is the wrong time to suspend the labor law wholesale. The first thing that's going to be the casualty is the safety and health, which is very much required now. Right now, there are standards of hygiene, sanitation, there are standards of toilets to be provided, creches to be provided where women employees they are there. All these will go in the wind if you do not have those measures in place and somebody ensuring the compliance. Self-compliance is something in this country which is taken very lightly. So we cannot do away with the inspection Raj until that sense of duty and sense of compliance to the law comes in. We have seen that when we were liberal, in countries which were liberal about lockdown, how did it go? Whereas in this country, when the police came on the street, everything came under control. So we are such a country. So here, if you suspend the law, it's going to be from frying pan to the fire. I don't think it is going to ensure any kind of well-being of the labor. And second point I would like to say is that labor law is not just about earning money and taking what we call as wages. It is about human right. It is about the right that has to be guaranteed by the government to the people, which has got a bearing on their, these are inalienable rights which infuse purpose into your life, meaning into your existence. Therefore, labor law plays a very important role. So how can we create a humane and just society without forum like an industrial dispute resolution mechanism being there, or collective bargaining through trade unions being there? If you look at India, today we have a very bad situation where minimum wages act has ensured some kind of minimum wages to be paid. That minimum wage fixation also is dependent on the kind of work, and also it is fixed by the state governments. Now, if Minimum Wages Act has been removed, and if Payment of Wages Act has been removed, then the employers will become very lackadaisical in terms of payment, because for them the meaning is only with the work and not with the welfare, not with the long-term relationship with the labor, because hire and fire becomes the logic. So employers' social responsibility, corporate social responsibility needs to be also read in this context, not reserving some fund for some other unseen kind of project. First, you protect those who are contributing their labor to the welfare of your organization. So blanket removal of labor law cannot be done until the system is mature to acknowledge the contribution of the labor. In last 60 years, we haven't had such a tapestry of uniform compliance and respect for the labor law. If you look at the IT industry, the very boom itself is dependent on hire and fire principle. but they can afford it because they are a skilled labor. But we cannot apply it to the labor who are manual labor, who are not intellectual labor. They are not into what we call as a knowledge society. So in that case, you cannot apply the same principle. Again, I am coming to the principle of homogeneity is not the reality. Therefore, your law will have to take into consideration those differentiated realities. And in order to serve humane considerations and justice, you have to see who is most vulnerable, who needs protection. Some kind of security mechanism should be there. In countries where there is hire and fire, they also have unemployment allowance. They have other social security measures. So you cannot have a kind of imbalance created, that you are selectively following this liberal labor law principles. On the other hand, you have not created the socially secure infrastructure. Then what will happen? There will be a kind of social unrest which will threaten the security, and where there is security at stake, no foreign investment will come. So in order to ensure security, you have to have a very society with peace and equilibrium. In order to ensure that, you have to take into consideration people's basic minimum needs. So imagine tomorrow, if there is no inspection, you will have factories running without toilets. It's like some of the quarantine facilities I was told was where people were dumped in places where there was no toilet. They had to go out in the open, and they thought that they were catching diseases because of that. That is why some of the migrant labor wanted to migrate, because the quarantine facilities were not up to the mark. They thought, instead of dying here, I'll go home and die. So we have such a situation in this country, which first needs to be fixed, and then we can bring step-by-step liberalization in terms of labor law, or confine these labor law reforms to only those segments where you also have some kind of a security mechanism in place. If labor law reforms as it is projected now in Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, and Gujarat come into effect, then provident fund responsibility will become less, healthcare responsibility and insurance facility provision will become less, women's safety and security will not be bothered, transportation facilities may not be taken care of. So it will result in less of welfare. We are still a welfare state. We are not China. So when we are a welfare state, which is the principle which is in the core of the constitution, we have to again use that potential of the constitution and introduce it by balancing the economic interest and economic upheaval with the humanitarian, humane and just ethos of the constitution as a welfare state.
What I understand from the whole subject is, in a hire and fire situation, the demand for labor. Now the problem is, in our case, the availability is very high, so demand is naturally spread out, and therefore the necessity to provide welfare to retain people is not really there. Otherwise, you would try to retain a person because his skills are necessary for you. They have got their skills and everybody looks for them, so they will always find another opportunity. The other part of it, as you rightly said, is the welfare infrastructure that is surrounding you when you lose your job. I think in the Western countries they have it. In India, we don't have it as yet. It's been a very interesting discussion, Dr. Shashikala, and we are discussing it for 45 minutes, but it's been very interesting, very illuminating, and for our viewers too. I would like to thank you for joining me on the show despite your very busy schedule, and thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity, Brian. It was interesting discussing with you. Thank you.
Thank you.